In the early 1960s, Las Vegas was not just a city of entertainment. It was a controlled machine powered by money, influence, and quiet intimidation. Casinos were not simply venues, they were territories, each with its own rules, alliances, and invisible lines that no one crossed without consequences. Among the most famous was the Sands Hotel, where a group of entertainers known as the Rat Pack turned performance into cultural mythology. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop were not just performers on a stage. They were a symbol of an era that mixed glamour with danger, charm with control, and friendship with the constant awareness that power always sat somewhere else in the room. On the surface, their shows were effortless. Music, comedy, improvisation, and the illusion of total freedom filled the Copa Room every night. But behind the curtain, the reality was more complicated. The Sands was owned and operated in a world where organized crime had deep financial influence over Las Vegas operations. That influence was rarely spoken about openly, but it shaped decisions, relationships, and sometimes even the safety of those who performed there. It was during one of these high-attendance engagements in 1962 that a moment occurred which would later become part of Rat Pack legend. The event itself was not originally presented as history-changing. At the time, it was seen as another night of performance, another crowded room, another audience expecting entertainment from some of the most recognizable figures in American show business. But within that night, tensions formed that reflected something larger than entertainment. Sammy Davis Jr. was performing at his peak. His reputation as a performer was built on precision, discipline, and emotional intensity. He was not simply singing. He was executing every note with a level of control that made his performances feel like lived experience rather than rehearsal. The audience response was consistent admiration. Yet not every person in the room was there purely for art or enjoyment. In one of the front sections sat a group of men whose presence carried a different weight. Among them was a figure later identified in accounts as a Chicago-connected mob associate known for his aggressive demeanor and lack of restraint in public environments. These were individuals accustomed to being treated with caution, not correction. In environments like the Sands, they were used to being entertained without resistance, regardless of how they behaved. At first, the disruption was subtle. Comments directed at the stage, laughter that did not match the rhythm of the performance, and a tone of entitlement that separated them from the rest of the audience. Performers in venues like this often learned to ignore such behavior. Confrontation was not always safe, and survival in entertainment sometimes meant endurance rather than response. Sammy Davis Jr. continued performing. His professionalism was well known, and like many black entertainers of the era, he had spent much of his career navigating environments where disrespect was often normalized and retaliation was not an option. The expectation was simple: keep performing, keep smiling, and do not interrupt the flow of entertainment, regardless of what was happening in the room. But the situation escalated. During a key moment in his performance, an act of deliberate disruption occurred. A bottle of champagne was opened and directed toward the stage, striking Sammy mid-performance. The liquid damaged his clothing, interrupted his movement, and immediately broke the rhythm of the performance. The music faltered as uncertainty spread across the band and audience. For a brief moment, the structured world of entertainment collapsed into something unpredictable and tense. The reaction in the room was immediate silence. Not confusion, but recognition. People understood that this was no longer casual disruption. It was targeted humiliation. It was an assertion of dominance in a space where visibility and status often determined behavior. Sammy paused. The instinct to continue was strong. Performers are trained to recover, to adapt, to move forward regardless of interruption. But the nature of this incident made continuation more complicated. It was not simply about recovering a song. It was about absorbing a public act of disrespect in front of thousands of people. At that moment, the environment shifted again. Dean Martin, who was not scheduled to be on stage, walked into view. His appearance was calm, controlled, and deliberate. There was no visible rush or emotional display. Instead, there was intention. He approached Sammy and positioned himself beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that immediately communicated alignment rather than observation. What happened next was not part of the planned performance. It became a confrontation that would later be retold in various forms, often blurred between documented memory and cultural retelling. Dean Martin addressed the source of the disruption directly. The tone was not loud, but it carried across the room in a way that demanded attention. The situation was no longer about entertainment. It had become about accountability inside a space where accountability was not usually enforced publicly. The front row group, particularly the individual responsible for the disruption, was now the focus of the entire room. What made the moment significant was not only the confrontation itself, but the shift in power dynamics it represented. In Las Vegas during this period, entertainers were often seen as replaceable. Influence sat elsewhere, and challenging those with criminal connections was not something done openly, especially in front of witnesses. Yet Dean Martin did not retreat from the situation. Instead, he escalated it into a demand for explanation and correction. The conversation that followed, according to multiple retellings of the incident, revolved around justification, entitlement, and refusal to accept disrespect as acceptable behavior. The tension in the room intensified because the stakes were not symbolic. They were real and understood by everyone present. The audience remained silent, aware that they were witnessing something that extended beyond performance. This was not scripted. It was not rehearsed. It was an unscheduled collision between celebrity, power, and organized influence inside one of the most famous entertainment venues in America. As the exchange continued, the pressure in the room shifted. The individual responsible for the disruption was no longer in control of the environment. The presence of witnesses changed the dynamic. Public spaces, especially in entertainment, can reverse authority when attention is fully directed. Dean Martin's position became clear. The disruption was not being ignored, minimized, or absorbed. It was being challenged directly, with consequences tied not to violence, but to exposure, reputation, and control of the show itself. In an environment where image mattered deeply, that shift carried weight. The moment did not escalate into physical conflict. Instead, it evolved into a standoff defined by presence, reputation, and the implicit understanding that control of the situation was no longer one-sided. What had begun as a performance interruption had transformed into a public assertion of boundaries inside a controlled entertainment space. As the situation stabilized, attention gradually returned to the stage. But nothing about the atmosphere was the same as before. The performance resumed, yet the meaning of the moment had already changed how it would later be remembered. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted into something far more restrained than what had unfolded in the Copa room, but no less charged. Performers and staff moved differently now, speaking in lower tones, avoiding speculation in public spaces, and quietly acknowledging that something had occurred which could not be easily undone or forgotten. In entertainment environments like Las Vegas in the early 1960s, moments like this did not simply disappear once the music resumed. They lingered in behavior, in memory, and in the way people recalibrated what was considered safe or acceptable. Inside those rooms, Sammy Davis Jr. felt that shift more personally than most. For him, the night was not just an interruption in a performance, but another reminder of the fragile space he occupied in the entertainment world. His career had always required an unusual combination of brilliance and resilience. He was expected to deliver excellence consistently, even in environments where respect was conditional and vulnerability could be exploited in real time. What had happened on stage was not unfamiliar in its underlying pattern, but the visibility of it, and the response it triggered, made it fundamentally different. Dean Martin's intervention became the central point of discussion afterward, though not always in the same language. Some described it as instinct, others as loyalty expressed without hesitation. Within the Rat Pack dynamic, there was an unspoken understanding that individual actions often carried collective meaning. Even when one person stepped forward, the weight of that action reflected on all of them, reinforcing the idea that their unity was not just performative for the audience, but functional in moments of pressure. What made this incident stand out in later retellings was not only the confrontation itself, but the refusal to let it dissolve quietly into the background of a routine night. In many similar situations during that era, especially when individuals With criminal influence were involved, incidents were softened, reinterpreted, or absorbed into silence once the immediate tension passed. That did not happen here. The moment remained visible, and that visibility changed its meaning. The man responsible for the disruption did not continue the confrontation after the exchange on the floor. Instead, the situation settled into an uneasy stillness that filled the room in a different way than music or laughter ever could. The performance resumed, but it did so under a changed emotional condition. The structure of entertainment remained intact, yet the psychological atmosphere had shifted permanently. As if everyone present now understood, they had witnessed something that existed outside the normal boundaries of show business. Audience members later recalled the remainder of the show as unusually subdued in feeling. Even moments designed for humor or lightness carried a different weight, as though the collective awareness of what had occurred remained present beneath the surface of every performance beat. It was not disruption in the traditional sense, but rather a shared recognition that the night had briefly stopped belonging to entertainment and had entered a more complicated space of real-world consequence. In the hours following the show, conversations within the Sands Hotel management structure focused less on the incident itself and more on what it represented. In Las Vegas at that time, perception carried significant operational importance. A single public moment could influence relationships, bookings, and the willingness of performers to work under certain conditions. The entertainment industry was not isolated from the broader power structures surrounding it, and events like this revealed how quickly control could shift when public attention aligned in unexpected ways. For the performers involved, particularly Sammy Davis Jr., the experience reinforced a truth he had carried throughout much of his life. Respect was not automatically granted by success. It had to be defended, negotiated, or sometimes reinforced through the actions of others willing to challenge the conditions in which he performed. The night became another entry in a long pattern of endurance, but also a rare example where that endurance was publicly acknowledged and actively supported in real time. As the incident began circulating in fragmented accounts among entertainers, venue workers, and industry associates, different versions of the story emerged. Some emphasized the disruption, others the confrontation, and others the reaction that followed. But the core structure of the event remained consistent across retellings. A public act of humiliation had been challenged directly in a way that disrupted the expectation of silence that often surrounded powerful individuals in entertainment spaces. Observers who were present later noted that the defining element of the moment was not aggression, but visibility. In environments where influence often dictated discretion, the refusal to retreat or minimize the incident created a lasting impression. It demonstrated that public accountability, even in spaces shaped by informal power structures, could still emerge when circumstances aligned in an unexpected way. Dean Martin's choice to step forward was later described as less strategic calculation and more personal loyalty. Within the Rat Pack dynamic, loyalty functioned as an active principle rather than a symbolic one. It required response, not just sentiment. If one member was disrespected, the expectation, spoken or unspoken, was that the group's presence would adjust accordingly, even if only one person physically acted in the moment. The aftermath also exposed how quickly status could become unstable when challenged in public. Influence that felt secure in private settings could appear less absolute when exposed to a broader audience. In this case, the presence of witnesses transformed what might have remained a private assertion of dominance into a public moment of accountability. That shift altered not only the tone of the evening, but also how it would later be remembered. Within industry circles, Sammy Davis Jr., in reflections shared later in his life, often described moments like this as more defining than applause or criticism. They revealed something deeper about the conditions under which dignity existed. For him, the significance of that night was not the disruption itself, but the fact that it was answered rather than ignored, creating a rare break in a pattern he had experienced for much of his career. Those who were present often described the event not as a scandal or confrontation in isolation, but as a turning point in how behavior was enforced within that specific entertainment environment. It demonstrated that even in spaces influenced by external power structures, public response could still reshape expectations, especially when witnessed collectively and without immediate reversal. In the broader legacy of the Rat Pack era, this Incident has continued to be referenced as an example of how entertainment, influence, and personal loyalty intersected under pressure. It remains part of the mythology surrounding Las Vegas in the 1960s, a period where glamour existed alongside unseen control systems that shaped outcomes behind the scenes. The story endures because it captures a rare moment where public defiance altered expected behavior in real time. It is frequently analyzed in discussions of Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and the Rat Pack as an illustration of loyalty expressed under pressure and the risks associated with challenging established power in visible settings. Over time, retellings have expanded the event beyond its immediate circumstances, transforming it into a symbolic narrative about dignity, respect, and the limits of intimidation within entertainment culture. It continues to be analyzed by historians, journalists, and cultural commentators as part of the broader evolution of celebrity power dynamics in mid-20th century America. But beyond analysis, the story endures because it reflects a simple human principle that transcends the era in which it occurred. It is the principle that dignity, once publicly defended, becomes something larger than reputation, and that even in environments defined by power and intimidation, a single act of loyalty can permanently reshape how people remember both the moment and the individuals who chose to stand within it in lasting cultural memory today still. In the years following that night at the Sands, the story began to take on a life of its own, gradually shifting from a backstage incident into something closer to cultural folklore. In Las Vegas, where entertainment history is often passed down through fragments of memory, half-confirmed accounts, and industry storytelling, moments like this rarely remain fixed. They evolve depending on who is telling them, what perspective they carry, and what they want the moment to represent. Some remembered it as a confrontation, others remembered it as a boundary being drawn. A few described it simply as the night the room stopped feeling safe for anyone who assumed power could not be challenged in public. What remained consistent across nearly all versions was the presence of a rupture in expectation. The Sands was a controlled environment in appearance, but like many major entertainment venues of its time, it operated within a layered structure of influence that extended beyond stage schedules and ticket sales. The people who performed there understood, even if only instinctively, that the audience was never truly uniform. Some came for entertainment, others came to observe status, and a few came expecting that their presence alone would shape how the night unfolded. That expectation was disrupted, not through chaos in the traditional sense, but through resistance that was both visible and deliberate. The significance of Dean Martin's intervention grew over time precisely because it did not escalate into violence nor dissolve into silence. Instead, it created a moment where the usual rules of deference and avoidance briefly stopped functioning. In environments like Las Vegas in the 1960s, that was unusual enough to be remembered. Within the entertainment industry, the incident also began to influence how performers privately discussed safety, respect, and boundaries in live venues. While public statements remained cautious, conversations behind closed doors reflected a growing awareness that even high-profile stages were not immune to moments where personal dignity could be challenged in front of large audiences. For Black performers in particular, the story carried additional weight. Sammy Davis Jr. was already one of the most visible and successful entertainers of his era. Yet his experiences reflected broader structural realities that fame alone could not eliminate. The reaction from those within his professional circle was often described as quietly supportive but deeply aware of what had been risked. Dean Martin's decision to step forward was not framed as symbolic at the time. It was immediate, reactive, and grounded in personal loyalty. Yet the consequences of that choice extended beyond the moment itself. It positioned him, intentionally or not, as someone willing to challenge not just behavior, but the assumptions that allowed that behavior to occur without consequence in public settings. In the broader context of Las Vegas entertainment history, the incident is frequently referenced alongside other moments where performer autonomy briefly intersected with external influence. However, what distinguishes this particular case is the clarity of roles within the moment itself. There was no ambiguity in how the disruption occurred, nor in how it was addressed. That clarity is part of why the story continues to be retold, analyzed, and reframed across different decades. Sammy Davis Jr.'s perspective on the event, shared in later interviews and recollections, often returned to the emotional contrast between expectation and reality. On one level, he had experienced disruption before. On another, he understood the rarity of what followed immediately after. In many environments, especially during that era, incidents of public humiliation were often absorbed by the performer as part of the job. What made this moment different was not the disruption itself, but the refusal to allow it to remain unchallenged in real time. That distinction carried emotional weight that extended far beyond the performance. It altered how the moment was internalized, not as an isolated incident, but as a deviation from a pattern that had long defined the boundaries of professional survival in entertainment. For Sammy, the significance was not simply that someone intervened, but that intervention occurred without hesitation, calculation, or retreat. As the Rat Pack's cultural influence continued to grow through the 1960s, the Sands Hotel incident became one of those stories that circulated alongside their performances, interviews, and public appearances. It was rarely emphasized in official promotion or mainstream coverage at the time, but it persisted in industry memory. Musicians, stage managers, comedians, and venue staff often referenced it indirectly when discussing the dynamics of respect in live performance environments. The narrative also began to take on symbolic weight in retrospective accounts of Las Vegas history. It became part of a larger framework used to describe how entertainment spaces functioned during a period when glamour and informal power structures coexisted in complex ways. Within that framework, the story is often used to illustrate how quickly performance spaces could transform into arenas of negotiation, where attention itself became a form of leverage. Over time, the identities involved in the incident became less important than the structure of the moment itself. The essential elements remained consistent: a public act of disrespect, a refusal to ignore it, and a response that altered the expected outcome of the situation. This structure is part of what allows the story to persist across generations, even as specific details are debated or romanticized. Dean Martin's role in particular has been subject to varying interpretations, ranging from spontaneous loyalty to calculated awareness of the stakes involved in publicly challenging someone with criminal associations. Regardless of interpretation, what remains central is the fact that the intervention occurred without escalation beyond verbal confrontation, yet still produced a clear reversal of control in the moment. For those who study entertainment history, the incident represents a rare convergence of celebrity culture, organized influence, and personal loyalty operating within a single public space. It highlights how fragile the boundaries of control could be in environments where multiple forms of power overlapped but were not always aligned. In such spaces, outcomes were not always dictated by hierarchy alone, but sometimes by the willingness of individuals to step outside expected behavior in defense of others. As decades passed, the Sands Hotel itself became part of a vanished era of Las Vegas history, replaced by new developments and changing cultural expectations. Yet stories like this continued to circulate, preserved not through official records alone, but through oral history, biographies, documentaries, and reinterpretations of the Rat Pack legacy. Each retelling added slight variations in tone and emphasis, but the core emotional structure remained intact. The enduring nature of the story lies in its simplicity beneath the surface complexity. It is ultimately about visibility, respect, and the moment when silence is replaced with action. In entertainment history, such moments are rare not because conflict is uncommon, but because public resistance within controlled environments carries risk that many are unwilling or unable to accept. This is why the Sands incident continues to be referenced not only as part of Rat Pack mythology, but as an example of how personal loyalty can intersect with public consequence. It exists at the intersection of performance and reality, where the boundary between entertainment and lived experience briefly disappeared. And in that brief disappearance, the meaning of the night was defined not by the act of disruption itself, but by the decision to confront it openly, in full view of everyone present, without retreat. In the final stretch of that night, and in the decades of memory that followed, it became increasingly clear that what happened at the Sands was never just about one disrupted performance. It became a reference point, a kind of cultural marker that people returned to whenever they discussed loyalty, power, and the fragile rules that governed entertainment spaces in mid-century America. The story outlived the moment because it captured something audiences instinctively recognize: the instant when performance stops being performance and becomes something closer to truth. Inside Las Vegas at the time, the entertainment industry was built on carefully maintained illusions. The audience was meant to feel spontaneity, glamour, and control, while behind the scenes an entirely different structure ensured that shows ran smoothly, regardless of external influence. But moments like the one involving Sammy Davis Jr. disrupted that balance. They revealed how quickly the illusion could fracture when personal dignity was challenged in a public space where reputations, both visible and invisible, were constantly negotiating with each other. By the time the immediate aftermath settled, the Sands returned to its usual rhythm. Shows continued, audiences arrived, and performers took the stage as scheduled. But something subtle had changed in how people understood the environment. It was no longer just a venue defined by entertainment value. It had, for a brief moment, become a space where boundaries were tested in real time, and where the response to those boundaries mattered as much as the performance itself. For Sammy Davis Jr., the long-term significance of the incident was not measured in applause or publicity. It was measured in perception. In later reflections, he often emphasized that experiences like that shaped how he understood his place in the industry. He was already a performer of extraordinary talent, but talent alone did not shield him from moments of vulnerability. What mattered more, in his view, was whether those moments were met with silence or acknowledgement. That night, for perhaps one of the few times in his career, acknowledgement came immediately and publicly. Dean Martin's role in that acknowledgement became part of how the story was preserved. Over time, it was retold in different formats: interviews, biographies, stage anecdotes, and documentary references. But the central idea remained consistent. He had chosen to intervene not through distance or suggestion, but through direct presence. That decision, regardless of how spontaneous or calculated it may have been, created a point of contrast that defined the emotional weight of the entire incident. In entertainment history, moments like this are often analyzed not for their surface events, but for what they reveal about underlying systems. The Sands incident is frequently discussed in that context, as an example of how visibility can shift power, even temporarily, in environments where hierarchy is assumed to be fixed. It demonstrated that the presence of witnesses can alter outcomes, and that public accountability does not always require formal authority, sometimes only the willingness to refuse silence. As the Rat Pack era continued, the mythology surrounding the group expanded beyond their performances. They were no longer seen only as entertainers, but as symbolic figures representing a specific cultural moment in American history. Within that mythology, the Sands incident became one of the defining stories used to illustrate the emotional reality behind the glamour. It was not simply about music or comedy. It was about loyalty, tested under pressure, and the visible choice to stand with someone when doing so carried real risk. For those who were present that night, or who heard the story shortly afterward, the memory of the moment remained vivid not because of its scale, but because of its clarity. There was no ambiguity in what occurred, and no confusion about how it was addressed. A line was crossed, and that crossing was not ignored. In environments where many such moments were often quietly absorbed or forgotten, that clarity stood out. Over time, as Las Vegas evolved and the Sands Hotel itself became part of a historical era rather than a current institution, the story gained additional layers of interpretation. It was no longer just an incident involving specific individuals. It became a narrative used to explore broader themes: respect in entertainment, the dynamics of public confrontation, and the way personal relationships can override expected behavior. In moments of tension. In modern retellings, the incident is often framed less as a confrontation and more as a defining illustration of what loyalty looks like when it is expressed publicly. That framing is part of why the story continues to circulate. It is not dependent on the details of one night alone, but on the emotional structure it represents: disruption, response, consequence, and resolution. Sammy Davis Jr.'s legacy as a performer is vast and complex, shaped by extraordinary talent, and the challenges he faced throughout his career. Within that larger legacy, the Sands incident occupies a specific place. It is not the defining achievement of his life, nor is it the central focus of his artistic contribution. But it remains one of the clearest examples of how his presence in the industry intersected with broader questions of dignity and recognition. For Dean Martin, the story became one of the most frequently referenced examples of his character within group dynamics. While much of his public persona emphasized ease, humor, and charm, this moment revealed a different dimension, one grounded in loyalty expressed through immediate action rather than explanation. In cultural memory, that contrast is part of what gives the story its lasting impact. As with many events from that era, the line between documented fact and narrative enhancement has blurred over time. Different accounts emphasize different details, and some elements have likely been shaped by repetition and retelling. But the emotional core of the story has remained stable. A moment of public disrespect occurred. It was not ignored. And in its aftermath, relationships, perceptions, and expectations were altered in ways that extended beyond a single performance. That is why the story continues to be revisited in documentaries, retrospectives, and cultural discussions about the Rat Pack in Las Vegas history. It functions as more than an anecdote. It operates as a symbolic case study in how visibility, loyalty, and confrontation interact in high-pressure environments where entertainment and power overlap. In the end, the Sands incident endures not because it was the most dramatic night in entertainment history, but because it revealed something fundamental about human behavior in public spaces. It showed that even in environments carefully designed to maintain control and illusion, moments of disruption can expose deeper truths about respect, solidarity, and the cost of remaining silent. And in that sense, the story is not just about one night in 1962. It is about what people choose to do when they are faced with a moment that demands a decision, whether to look away or to stand beside someone when it matters most.